When I was at Purdue 2 years ago and gave a talk to a couple thousand students, there was a huge gallery. I had a Q&A afterwards, of course, largely a non-Christian audience, and a question that came up frequently, more than once in different forms, had to do with the historical reliability of the Gospels. In particular, the question of whether Jesus story was just a rebirth of the dying, rising God mythology of ancient times, and some had fancies there are similarities between these ancient myths, Osiris, for example, in Egypt, and the life of Jesus, and so they presume then that this is simply a copy job that's being done, a recycled redeemer kind of thing. And I think it's a fair challenge, and it needs to be addressed, but I want you to think about for a moment what would have to be the case for that to be true. First of all, the myths in question would have to come before the account of the life of Jesus. Okay? In other words, the daughter has to come before the mother kind of thing. That would have to be the first thing. The second thing is that there would have to be a meaningful relationship between the details of the myth and the life of Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, there'd have to be some kind of close correspondence to the details before I think it's fair to raise the question. And the third thing is there would have to be little or no independent evidence for the accuracy of the details of the life of Jesus that we find in the primary source documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And let me tell you why that last point is important. Because the only reason that one would speculate whether this story about Jesus was an invention based on earlier myths is if the story itself was not grounded in history. If we have no good reason to believe the story actually reflected historical events in the first century, then we might ask, well, where did the story come from? And then we can look to these earlier myths as a possible explanation. Those three things are important. And when you put it this way, the force of this objection or challenge completely dissipates. For one, many of the so-called similarities between Jesus and these ancient dying and rising messiahs don't show up until after the time of Jesus. So the Gospels come first, and then these accounts show up that reflect some of the details. In fact, the details that are most like the person of Jesus are in the accounts that show up after the time of Jesus, not before the time of Jesus. Secondly, when you look at those details that we can actually demonstrate came before the time of Jesus, it turns out that there's almost no similarity at all. Vague similarities like, the gods die in the fall, and this would be the agricultural gods like Baal and Ashtoreth. They die in the fall, and that's why the crops die and winter comes, and then they are reborn in the spring. They rise again in the spring, or the sun dies in the evening and rises again in the morning when it comes up again. So this is the vaguest similarity. In fact, it's not even fair to call these things a similarity with the life of Jesus. But the third thing is the most important. Even if you have really tight similarities of accounts that were mythical that came before the time of Jesus, you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that the story of Jesus was based on those accounts if there was good evidence that the account of Jesus that we have in the New Testament is reliable on its own merits. There was a famous book that was written, and now I'm digging for the name, but it was written at the end of the 19th century. It talked about a ship called Titan that made a transatlantic voyage between England and New York and then struck an iceberg and sunk, and it was an unsinkable ship and traveling at certain speeds with 3 propellers, and more than half of the people died in the sinking. These were all details, of course, that perfectly match the actual historical event that happened some 15 years later with the sinking of the Titanic. Now, we wouldn't say that because it was a fictional account earlier, we have no reason to trust the alleged historical account that came later simply because there are similarities. No, we'd want to look at the historical account on its own merits and see is there good evidence for that. And if there is, then we say, wow, what a coincidence. And that's actually what took place with this particular book and with the Titanic. And in the case of the Gospels, what we have is we have an account of the life of Jesus that is well established on historical documentation and historical evidence itself. In other words, on the merits, we have good reason to trust the story. It's only if we have no good reason to trust the story as coming from history that we ask ourselves, well, where did it come from then? And then we might be tempted to look back at some other literary source that gave those writers the idea. But since there is good, solid historical evidence to trust the primary source historical accounts on the merits, then we have no need nor temptation to look back to other sources. And therefore, any challenges or claims based on similarities of other sources just fall to the dust.